close your eyes for a moment and imagine that you are hungry. Not the mild inconvenience of skipping lunch or waiting too long between meals. Genuinely, deeply hungry in a way that shapes every decision you make, every relationship you maintain, every prayer you say before sleep. Now open your eyes and find yourself in Europe in the year 1050. The hunger you feel is not a personal failure. It is the background condition of most human life on this continent, punctuated by moments of extraordinary abundance for those at the very top, and relieved only partially and temporarily for almost everyone else. Food in the medieval world of the 11th century was not a lifestyle choice, a source of entertainment, or an aesthetic experience, though it could be all of those things for the privileged few. For the vast majority of the 30 or 40 million people living in Europe at this time, food was survival, and the getting of it consumed most of the energy of most days. This is a story about what people ate in the 1000s. But it is also a story about power, because who ate what was never simply a matter of taste or availability. It was a matter of law, of class, of religious obligation, and of the deeply embedded social hierarchies that structured everything from a king's coronation banquet to a peasant's evening bowl of pottage. To understand food in the medieval world is to understand the medieval world itself. And that is exactly what we are going to do over the next 25 minutes. We're going to sit at the royal feast table, lean against the wall of a smoky tavern, and crouch beside the peasant's fire, tasting as we go. Let us begin at the top, because the contrast with what comes later is essential. A royal feast in 11th century Europe was one of the most elaborate and carefully orchestrated performances of power that the period produced. When a king feasted, he was not merely eating. He was governing. He was demonstrating his legitimacy, his generosity, and his dominance over the lords who sat at his table. He was binding his followers to him through the most ancient of social rituals, the sharing of food and drink. The obligation of a lord to feed his followers was so fundamental to the social contract of the medieval world that a lord who failed to provide adequate hospitality was failing in one of his most basic duties. Food was politics, and the royal feast table was a political stage. Imagine the great hall of an 11th century royal palace, somewhere in England, France, or the Holy Roman Empire. The building itself is impressive by the standards of the time. A long rectangular hall with stone or timber walls, high enough to accommodate the smoke from the central hearths, hung with tapestries and banners that served both decorative and insulating purposes. The floor might be strewn with rushes or sweet-smelling herbs. On the high days and feast days that marked the royal calendar, this space was transformed. Trestle tables were set up in long rows, covered with white linen cloths, a luxury in itself. The Lord's table, the high table, was placed on a raised dais at one end, elevated so that everyone in the hall could see the king or lord eating and be seen eating in relation to him. The hierarchies of the feast were expressed spatially and materially at every level. Where you sat determined what you ate, and what you ate announced to everyone present where you stood in the social order. The finest dishes, the most elaborate preparations, the rarest spices and imported wines went to the high table. As you moved down the hall, away from the dais, the food became plainer, the portions smaller, the drink rougher. Sitting above or below the salt, the large ceremonial salt cellar placed at the midpoint of the main table was a marker of social status so significant that the expression passed into the English language and has stayed there ever since. What did a royal feast in the 1000s actually consist of? The sheer quantity of food served was designed to overwhelm. A royal feast was not one course. It was a succession of removes, each containing multiple dishes presented simultaneously, covering the tables so densely that there was barely room for the cups. Meat dominated the high end of the medieval table. Venison from the royal forests, which were jealously protected hunting grounds to which only the king and his favorites had legal access. Wild boar, hunted in the great forests that still covered much of 11th century Europe. Swan, peacock, and heron, birds whose consumption was a privilege of the highest rank. Roasted whole on spits over the fire. These prestige meats were sometimes served in spectacular ways. A peacock might be skinned before roasting, the skin carefully preserved, and then dressed back onto the cooked bird so that it arrived at table with its feathers intact and its tail spread, a theatrical centerpiece designed to produce gasps of admiration from the assembled guests. The spices that seasoned royal food were as important as the meat itself, perhaps more so. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, mace, saffron. These were not cheap flavoring agents. They were luxury imports from the Far East, arriving in Europe through the trading networks of the Eastern Mediterranean via Arab and Byzantine intermediaries at enormous expense. A pound of pepper in 11th century England was worth roughly a day's wages for a skilled craftsman. Saffron, requiring the hand-harvesting of thousands of crocus stamens to produce a single ounce, was worth more than gold by weight. The conspicuous use of spices in royal and aristocratic cooking was therefore a direct financial statement. When the royal cook dusted a dish with a visible cloud of cinnamon or colored a sauce the deep yellow of saffron, he was serving a message as much as a meal. This household is rich enough to burn money as seasoning. The sauces of medieval high cuisine were complex, layered preparations that bear almost no resemblance to what the word sauce means today. They were often thickened with breadcrumbs or ground almonds rather than flour or butter, flavored with combinations of spices that seem extreme by modern tastes, and balanced between sweet and sour using verjuice, a sharp juice pressed from unripe grapes or crab apples, and honey or sugar. Sugar, like pepper, was a spice at this period, available in small quantities and at high prices, and its use in a savory meat dish was not the culinary confusion it might seem to us, but a deliberate play of flavors that medieval diners found sophisticated and desirable. A sauce for roasted pork at a royal feast might contain ginger, cinnamon, pepper, cloves, verjuice, honey, and toasted breadcrumbs ground together with wine, producing something simultaneously hot, sweet, sour, and powerfully aromatic. Wine at the royal feast was French, because French wine, particularly from the regions of Burgundy, the Loire, and later Bordeaux, was already established as the prestige drink of the European aristocracy. English kings drank French wine partly because their political and family connections were deeply French. The Norman dynasty that took the English throne in 1066 with William the Conqueror was French in language, culture, and taste. But wine was also drunk across northern and central Europe wherever the nobility could afford it, imported at great expense, and served in vessels that were themselves status objects. Gold and silver cups, drinking horns mounted with precious metal fittings, imported glass from the Eastern Mediterranean. The vessel from which you drank at a royal feast was another statement about where you stood. Ale was the universal drink below the wine line. At the high table, the lord might drink wine, while his household knights and senior servants drank ale. At the lower tables, ale was the only option. This was not the thin, flavorless liquid that the word might suggest. Medieval ale was brewed from barley malt, water, and sometimes oats, fermented to varying degrees of strength, and might be flavored with herbs such as ground ivy, yarrow, or mugwort before hops became the standard bittering and preserving agent later in the medieval period. It was cloudy, nutritious, low enough in alcohol to be consumed in large quantities throughout the day without incapacitating the drinker, and absolutely central to the caloric intake of people at every level of society. A laboring man in the 11th century might drink a gallon of ale per day, not out of alcoholism, but because ale provided calories, hydration, and a degree of safety that the local water supply often did not. The performance of the royal feast extended beyond the food itself to the entire choreography of service. The carver who cut the meat at the high table was performing a skilled public role that required training and technique. To carve before the king was an honor reserved for men of high birth, and the elaborate vocabulary of carving terms, with specific verbs for dismembering different birds and animals, was part of the cultural knowledge that marked a gentleman. To unlace a rabbit, to display a crane, to break a deer, these terms were not merely technical. They were a social code, and knowing them and performing them correctly was a demonstration of breeding and education. The cup-bearer who presented wine to the king knelt in service, and the act of kneeling before presenting the cup was not a sign of degradation, but of respect and ritual acknowledgement of hierarchy. Music accompanied the great feast. Minstrels and jongleur moved through the hall, playing harps, fiddles, flutes, and percussion instruments, singing narrative songs that celebrated the deeds of legendary heroes or the virtues of the Lord being honored. Between removes, acrobats might perform, or a fool might provide comic entertainment. The feast was a total sensory experience, and its management required the coordination of dozens or hundreds of people working in the kitchens, the pantry, the buttery, and the hall itself. The royal kitchen of an 11th century palace was an industrial operation. Multiple hearths and ovens running simultaneously, a hierarchy of cooks, scullions, and kitchen boys, supplies arriving from the royal estates and the market, and the constant pressure of timing everything to arrive at the table at the correct temperature and in the correct sequence. Now, let us leave the great hall and walk out into the colder, darker, noisier world of the tavern. In the cities and towns of 11th century Europe, which were small by modern standards but growing in economic importance, taverns and alehouses occupied an essential social role. They were not simply places to drink, though they were certainly that. They were the public social space of people who had no private hall, no lord's table, no invitation to the feast. They were where news was exchanged, where deals were struck, where travelers found a meal and a bed, where the tensions and pleasures of urban life played out in close quarters and with the loosening effect of alcohol. The distinction between a tavern and an alehouse in the 1000s was not always clearly drawn, but roughly speaking, a tavern sold wine, while an alehouse sold ale. Wine taverns were more upscale and more likely to be found in major trading cities with access to imports. Alehouses were everywhere because ale was produced domestically by almost every household with the means to do so, and the surplus was sold. An alewife, a woman who brewed ale at home and sold it from her house, was a common figure in 11th century towns and villages. The ale stake, a long pole hung over the door with a bush of leaves or a bunch of straw at the end, was the universal sign that ale was for sale within, the equivalent of a modern shop sign, and its presence transformed an ordinary house into a public drinking space. The food available in a tavern in the 1000s was simple, limited, and filling. This was not fine dining. It was sustenance for travelers, laborers, and the working poor who either could not or would not cook at home. A traveler arriving at a roadside tavern in 11th century France or England might expect to find bread, always bread, the staff of life without which no meal in this period was conceivable. Alongside the bread, there might be a dish of pottage, the universal peasant food that we will examine more closely in a moment. Dried or salted fish was commonly available because of the church's fasting requirements. Cheese was common, since dairy production was widespread and cheese kept reasonably well without refrigeration. Hard-boiled eggs were another tavern staple, easy to prepare in large quantities and to hold until needed. Occasionally, there would be roasted meat of some kind, a joint slowly turning on a spit over the fire, available by the slice to those who could afford it. The atmosphere of the tavern was intimate and not always comfortable. Tavern buildings in the 11th century were typically timber frame structures with thatched roofs, low ceilings, and limited ventilation. The fire that heated the space also filled it with smoke. The furniture was rough, trestle tables and benches, no upholstered chairs, no privacy. You sat where there was room. Your neighbors were whoever else was there. A merchant from another town, a group of apprentices celebrating the end of a working week, a monk on a journey who would rather not be seen in such a place, a prostitute working the edges of the crowd, a local craftsman who came every evening as a matter of habit. The sounds were voices in multiple languages in a trading town, the thump of cups on wooden tables, arguments and laughter, and in the background the crackle of the fire. Credit and cash existed uneasily in the tavern economy. Coins were in circulation, but not uniformly available to everyone, and the denomination of coinage was not always well suited to small transactions. Tavern keepers often extended informal credit to regular customers, keeping a tally, literally a notched stick on which debts were recorded until payment was settled. The tally stick was a sophisticated accounting tool that required no literacy to use and was trusted by both parties because each held one half of the split stick, which had to match when the account was settled. This simple technology underpinned a great deal of small-scale medieval commerce in the tavern and elsewhere. Gaming was a constant feature of tavern life and a constant source of trouble. Dice games were the most widespread form of gambling, simple to play, requiring no equipment beyond a pair of dice, and capable of producing rapid reversals of fortune that could turn a convivial evening into a violent confrontation within minutes. Church authorities repeatedly condemned gambling, particularly in alehouses and taverns, which they associated with all manner of sin. Drinking to excess, brawling, sexual misconduct, and the waste of resources that God had given for better purposes. These condemnations had approximately as much effect on tavern gambling in the 11th century as equivalent prohibitions have ever had on human behavior, which is to say very little. The church's complicated relationship with the tavern is worth pausing on. On one hand, the church condemned excessive drinking, gambling, prostitution, and the general dissolution that tavern culture could facilitate. On the other hand, monasteries brewed their own ale and wine, often of excellent quality, and some monastic establishments operated hospices and guest facilities that functioned very much like taverns for travelers. Being adjacent to a monastery, where pilgrims and travelers could find a bed and a meal, was a legitimate and respected institution. The boundary between respectable hospitality and dissolute tavern culture was in practice blurry and contested, and it was drawn differently depending on who was doing the drawing. A pilgrim traveling in 11th century Europe was one of the most common types of long-distance traveler, and the infrastructure of food and accommodation that grew up to serve pilgrims shaped the tavern and in culture of the period significantly. The pilgrimage routes to Rome, to Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain, and to Jerusalem were busy highways, traveled by thousands of people every year, and the towns and villages along these routes develop hospitality industries to serve them. Food at a pilgrim inn might be slightly better than at a roadside alehouse, since the institutions serving pilgrims had reputational incentives to provide adequate care. But it was still simple: bread, pottage, legumes, dried fish, and ale, or the local equivalent, wherever you happen to be. Now let us go deeper, further from the palace and the town, out into the countryside where most of the population of 11th century Europe actually lived. The village and the peasant smallholding is where the story of medieval food is really written, because it is where the overwhelming majority of people actually ate. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 80 and 90% of the European population in the 1000s lived in rural areas, farming the land, tending animals, managing woodland, and producing the agricultural surplus that fed the towns and paid for the feasts of the nobility. These people ate what they could grow, what they could gather, and what they could occasionally afford to buy, and for most of the time, this meant a diet centered on grain, legumes, and whatever vegetables and herbs they could cultivate in their kitchen gardens. The central food of peasant life was pottage, and we should spend some time with it because it was so dominant, so various, and so easily dismissed or misunderstood. Pottage was not a single dish with a fixed recipe. It was a category of food, anything cooked in a pot with liquid. In its most basic form, it was grain, most often oats, barley, or a mixture of both, cooked in water until thick. This bare-bones pottage, sometimes called gruel when very thin, was what stood between many peasant families and starvation in the hard months of late winter and early spring, when the previous year's stores were running low and the new harvest was still months away. It was hot, it was filling in the short term, and it provided calories, but it was nutritionally limited and monotonous in a way that must have been deeply demoralizing. But pottage at its best was a great deal more than gruel. A peasant household with a productive kitchen garden, a few animals, and reasonable access to woodland could produce a pottage of genuine variety and flavor. Dried peas and beans, which were cultivated widely across Europe in the 11th century, could be simmered into the grain base, providing protein that transformed a simple starch dish into something more nutritionally complete. Onions were a staple of the peasant garden, growing easily, storing well, and adding flavor to almost anything they touched. Leeks, another hardy and easily grown vegetable, were so associated with peasant cooking in some regions that they became a kind of cultural symbol. Cabbages and their relatives, turnips, parsnips, and garlic. All of these went into the pot when they were available. Herbs from the kitchen garden were not merely flavoring. In the absence of modern medicine, herbs served therapeutic as well as culinary purposes, and the knowledge of which herbs helped with which ailments was practical wisdom that every household head was expected to possess. Parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, and mint all grew in medieval kitchen gardens and all found their way into the cooking pot. The flavor of a well-made peasant pottage, rich with onions and leeks, thickened with dried peas, fragrant with herbs, was not the punishment that the word gruel implies. It was real food, and its makers were skilled at producing the best result from limited ingredients. Meat in a peasant household was a carefully rationed luxury. The pig was the most important meat animal in the peasant economy. Kept in small numbers, fed on kitchen scraps and woodland mast, the acorns and beech nuts of the forest that were a crucial food source for the animals of the medieval village. The pig was slaughtered in late autumn, when it had fattened through the summer and autumn, and when the onset of cold weather meant that the meat could be preserved before it spoiled. The slaughter of the family pig was a significant event in the agricultural year, involving the whole family and sometimes neighbors, and almost every part of the animal used. The flesh salted or smoked for the winter months, the offal eaten immediately, the fat rendered for cooking and candle making, the blood used to make black puddings, the bones cracked for their marrow, and then boiled for stock. Nothing was wasted, because nothing could be afforded to waste. Chickens and other poultry were kept by most peasant households, but they were more valuable as producers of eggs than as meat. An egg a day from a productive hen was a genuine economic contribution to the household, providing protein through the long months when fresh meat was unavailable. Killing a hen for food was a decision made reluctantly, usually when the bird was past its productive laying life. Geese were kept for their feathers as well as their meat and eggs, the feathers being essential for bedding and for the quills used as writing instruments by the literate minority. Ducks could forage for themselves in ponds and marshes and required less management than chickens. Fish was crucial to the peasant diet for a reason that had nothing to do with taste or availability. It was required by the church. The number of days in the ecclesiastical year on which the consumption of meat was forbidden was substantial, reaching in the most rigorous interpretations something approaching half the days of the year when you count not only Lent, but also Fridays, Saturdays, the vigils of major feasts, and the Ember Days. For people in coastal areas and near rivers, fresh fish was available and relatively cheap. For those further inland, fish meant dried, salted, or smoked fish, cod, herring, and other species that could be preserved and transported. Stockfish, which was cod dried hard in the cold Scandinavian air without salt, was traded across remarkable distances in the 11th century, arriving in English and continental markets from Norway and Iceland. It was cheap, incredibly durable, and could be reconstituted by soaking and beating, producing a dense, strongly flavored protein source that was indispensable on fast days. Dairy products occupied an important middle position in the peasant diet. A household that kept a cow or a few goats had access to milk, butter, and cheese, all of which provided fat and protein that were otherwise difficult to obtain. Cheese was particularly important because it could be aged and stored, extending the productive output of the dairy animals beyond the season of peak milk production. The variety of cheeses available in the 11th century was limited compared to later periods, but simple fresh cheeses made by curdling warm milk with acid or rennet and straining off the whey were produced domestically in enormous quantities. Butter was churned by hand in wooden churns and used both for cooking and as a spread on bread, when bread was available, and salted when it needed to be preserved. Bread itself was not always available to peasants in the way that our modern imagination might assume. The grain to make bread had to be grown, harvested, stored, and ground, and each of these stages involved costs, labor, and the risk of loss through weather, pests, or feudal extraction. The lord's right to take a portion of the peasant's grain as rent, and the obligation to grind that grain at the lord's mill for a further fee, meant that the household's grain supply was never entirely its own. In good years, bread was a daily reality and a genuine pleasure. In bad years, the grain might run out before the next harvest, and pottage made from the last of the oat stores replaced bread entirely. The quality of bread available varied enormously by social position. White bread made from finely sifted wheat flour was the preserve of the wealthy, and its whiteness was itself a status symbol because it required more processing and better grain to produce. The peasant's bread was dark, dense, and coarse, made from rye, barley, or a mixture of grains including sometimes dried legumes ground in with the grain to extend the supply. Maslin bread, made from a mixture of wheat and rye, was common in regions where both grains were grown and represented a practical compromise between the white ideal and the coarse reality. This bread was not bad. Dense, slightly sour from the rye content, chewy, and sustaining, it was a complete food in itself when eaten with cheese or pottage. Salt was as fundamental to the medieval food system as grain itself, because without salt, it was impossible to preserve meat and fish through the winter months, and without preserved meat and fish, the winter diet became desperately limited. The salt trade in 11th century Europe was correspondingly vital. Major salt-producing regions, whether using sea salt evaporated in salt pans along the Atlantic coast and the Mediterranean or rock salt mined from deposits in Central Europe, were linked by trade routes that stretched across the continent. A community without access to salt, either through local production or trade, faced serious problems of food security that went beyond mere inconvenience. Salt also had important uses in dairy production, in tanning leather, and in certain craft processes, making it genuinely indispensable to medieval life in a way that its invisibility in modern cooking does not suggest. The seasonality of the medieval diet was absolute in a way that nothing in modern food culture can replicate for someone living in a country with supermarkets and global supply chains. What you ate depended almost entirely on what was in season, what had been successfully preserved from earlier seasons, and what the current year's harvest and husbandry had produced. Spring was the hungry time. The winter stores were diminishing or exhausted. The new growing season had barely begun, and the gap between the last of the old food and the first of the new was a genuine crisis in bad years. People ate the first green shoots of nettles and other wild plants, bark bread in extreme famines, and whatever they could find in the greening woodland. Summer brought increasing abundance. Wild berries, garden vegetables, the first of the season's eggs in greater numbers as the hens began laying again. Autumn was the time of harvest, slaughter, and preservation, the brief window of maximum abundance in which the entire year's food security had to be consolidated against the coming winter. Winter was endurance, and the management of stored food through the dark months was one of the central skills of peasant household management. Famine was not a remote possibility in the 11th century. It was a recurring reality that every generation experienced in some form. The causes were multiple and interacting. A summer of drought or too much rain could devastate the grain harvest. A harsh winter that killed the livestock depleted the working animals needed for spring plowing. A siege or an army moving through the countryside stripped the land of its stored food in days. The infrastructure to move food from surplus regions to deficit regions was limited, slow, and expensive. When famine struck a region in the 1000s, the death toll among the poor could be catastrophic, and the evidence in chronicles and cemetery excavations of this period shows that nutritional stress was a chronic condition for many people even in normal years. Children and the elderly were the most vulnerable members of the medieval food system, as they always are in conditions of scarcity. A child born into a peasant family in 11th century Europe faced mortality risks in infancy and early childhood that modern medicine has largely eliminated in wealthy countries. Malnutrition compromised immune function and made every infectious disease more dangerous. The bones of medieval children recovered from archaeological sites frequently show signs of nutritional deficiency. Harris lines on the long bones indicating periods of growth interruption from starvation or illness, dental enamel defects from the same causes, and evidence of rickets from inadequate vitamin D in winter diets. The medieval body carried its history in its skeleton, and the skeleton often tells a story of hunger endured and survived or not survived. And yet, the food culture of 11th century Europe was not simply a story of deprivation and suffering. It was also a story of remarkable skill, deep knowledge, and genuine pleasure. The peasant cook who transformed limited, seasonal, often low-quality ingredients into nourishing and flavorful meals was exercising a craft of real sophistication. The knowledge required to manage a kitchen garden through the seasons, to brew acceptable ale from homegrown grain, to salt and smoke meat and fish properly, to make cheese, to forage for wild foods, to know which wild plants were edible and which were poisonous, to manage the timing of slaughter and preservation. This was an education that took years to acquire and that represented a body of practical intelligence easily the equal of any formal academic knowledge. The communal dimension of food in the medieval village deserves emphasis. The individual household was the basic unit of production and consumption, but food in the 1000s was also deeply communal. The harvest required collective labor, and the customs around harvest work, the gleaning rites that allowed the poorest to gather grain left behind by the harvesters, the harvest supper that the Lord was expected to provide for the workers who had brought in his crops, these were not merely practical arrangements. They were social rituals that reinforced the web of obligation and mutual dependence that held the village together. The ale drunk at the harvest supper was brewed by women of the village. The bread was baked in communal ovens. The meat, if there was meat, came from animals raised collectively or from the Lord's stores. Eating together was performing community. Religious feast days, even for the poorest, were genuine occasions for better eating, because the obligation of charity that Christianity imposed on those with means extended to providing at least minimally better food on the high days of the calendar. The Christmas feast, Easter, Pentecost, and the feasts of major saints were occasions when even the poorest members of a community might receive alms that included food, bread, ale, and occasionally something more substantial. The monastic system, whatever its other complications, provided a genuine safety net of food distribution to the poor, particularly through the almonry, the office responsible for distributing charity. Monasteries were expected to feed the poor who came to their gates, and in periods of famine this function became enormously important. The food of the 1000s in Europe was, in the end, a mirror of the society that produced and consumed it. It reflected the hierarchies of power and status with ruthless precision, from the spiced meats of the royal feast to the salt and bread of the peasant's daily existence. It reflected the power of religion to shape every aspect of daily life through the system of fasting and feast days that restructured the rhythm of eating across the entire year. It reflected the deep vulnerability of an agricultural system without the technological buffers that modern societies take for granted, and the constant creativity and skill that people deployed to manage within that vulnerability. What it also reflected, if we look carefully enough, is a genuine human pleasure in food, even in conditions of scarcity and constraint. The care taken with herbs in a peasant pottage, the pride of the royal cook in a perfectly executed feast, the sociability of the alehouse, where ale smoothed the edges of a hard week and conversation ranged freely across the concerns of the neighborhood. The harvest supper eaten outdoors at the end of a long day's collective labor, with the satisfaction of a year's work completed and a barn full of grain against the winter. These moments of pleasure and communal warmth were real, and they remind us that the people of the 1000s were not merely victims of history. They were people fully alive to the texture of their world, making the most of what they had, and finding in the preparation and sharing of food something that every human culture in every era has found. Not merely fuel, but meaning.